Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. A seed planted today takes root and grows into a tree that bears fruit in the future. Over 110 years ago, a seed was planted. Today, that seed, the idea of excellence, has grown into the University of Pretoria, South Africa's largest contact research-intensive university. 9 faculties and a business school are spread across 7 beautiful campuses, which are home to over 50,000 students, ready to make an impact in the world beyond university and join our global network of nearly 300,000 alumni. Future-focused, sustainably developed facilities and cutting-edge multi- and transdisciplinary research are underpinned by a desire to transform lives and have a positive impact on communities and the world. Excellence in teaching, learning, research innovation, arts and culture, and sports puts us firmly amongst the world's best universities. Knowledge is not just what is in books. It is the wisdom to apply it, to nourish and nurture the seed so that it takes root, grows tall, bears fruit, and branches out. UP plants that seed, that tiny bit of curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, hope, the desire to care, respect, help, and innovate against all odds, to grow, to leave your mark, to excel, to challenge the norm, to think, to rethink, to discover, to inquire, to lead, to have courage, to make a difference, and to persevere. This is the University of Pretoria. We make today and every day matter.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the 2021 South Africa Economic Update themed Building Back Better post-COVID-19 with a special focus on jobs. We're coming to you live from the Future Africa campus at the University of Pretoria. A special welcome to all our guests joining us today. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute privilege and an honor to be your moderator of this critically important conversation. Now, the context for this event and conversation is really significant and worth noting. The World Bank will today release the new South Africa Economic Update. This report comes at a time when South Africa is in the throes of the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so it's very timely in its offering of a review of the country's economic outlook with a specific focus on jobs. Now, given that South Africa does not exist in a vacuum, the team will also share some highlights of the Global Economic Prospects Report. And so we're going to meet and hear from the World Bank team, and they will be sharing their insights on policy options and how we might go about rejuvenating the jobs market, whilst also tracking upwards in terms of improving the investment climate needed to build a better and increasingly inclusive economy post-COVID-19. Now, as always, we really love hearing from all of you joining us online. So do engage with us by sending us your comments and your questions. But also remember that you can amplify this conversation on social media using the following 2 hashtags: World Bank Economic Report, World Bank Economic Report, and SA Economic Report, SA Economic Report. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, Prof. Kupe, to officially welcome his guests. Prof. Kupe, it's over to you, sir.
Ms. Francois Marie Lee, Country Director, Southern Africa, World Bank; Franziska Ohnsorge, Manager, World Bank Global Economic Team; Wolfgang Fengler, Lead Economist, South Africa; Benedicte Baduel, Senior Economist, South Africa; esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, partner organizations, media, and all joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because you are joining us from all over the globe. I'm pleased to welcome everyone here today as we launch the 13th edition of the South Africa Economic Update Report, a biannual World Bank flagship publication on the state of the South Africa's economy. The University of Pretoria appreciates the partnership that we have with the World Bank as we work together in our unique capacities to support South Africa to fulfill its development agenda and contribute to ending extreme poverty, promoting shared prosperity, and growing an inclusive economy. Grateful thanks go out to every member of the core team who prepared this team, led by senior economists Benedicte Baduel and Fakuda Kuvas, and lead economist Wolfgang Fengler, as well as to those who provided research support, guidance, and the numerous other contributions which make this type of rigorous, valuable work possible. Marie Lee, World Bank Country Director, Southern Africa, will give us some detail into the contents of the report, which summarizes the country's recent economic developments and outlook, as well as taking a deeper analytical look into a topic of special interest and high relevance, the impact of COVID-19 crisis, particularly on the job market, where, amongst others, the crisis has been exposing South Africa's structural weaknesses. The numbers may paint a very bleak picture and road ahead, but let us be reminded that history is not inevitable, and this may well be the inflection point which South Africa and indeed Africa needs. The pandemic has in some instances been compared to the last great global catastrophe, World War II. Contrary to earlier predictions, what followed the war was a broad period of worldwide economic expansion, giving rise to the likes of the golden age for the USA and the Japanese economic miracle. While the reasons underpinning these turnarounds are deeply nuanced, it is true to say that despite devastation of the pandemic, opportunities have emerged, and it is for us to seize the opportunities. The 2019 economic report was focused on tertiary education, and we launched it here at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria with a, quote, revamped distance learning model, unquote, cited as an option for South Africa to solve the trade-off between supporting more students and encouraging higher enrollment. This is certainly an area where the COVID-19 crisis has catapulted society into an entirely new perspective. The University of Pretoria, which already had a mature learning management system in place, was able to achieve an almost seamless transition to online instruction. And having seen the possibilities over the past 15 months, it is unlikely that we'll ever again revert to contact-only teaching and learning. This evolution has been echoed across the country and will no doubt lead to a revamped educational model which opens up possibilities not previously considered, including expanding access. Having been brought to a crossroads, we have a historic opportunity to change course, to rebuild our economy and generate a recovery that ensures a broad and lasting rise in prosperity, especially for the poorest, the excluded, and the most marginalized. It's an opportunity we cannot afford to pass up. There's an important role for both the public and the private sector to play in this, as well as cooperation needed between policymakers, development practitioners, and academics, in particular the research community. We look forward to the analysis in this economic update, contributing to the national debate and discourses on an important topic, and for it to help inform policy decisions that will re-energize South Africa's economy and labor markets. As a university, we've been reimagining our role in society and are focused on cutting-edge transdisciplinary research to help break new ground and tackle unanswered questions in a world facing overwhelming challenges and continuous disruptions. All of our 55,000 students are working hard to complete their programs on time so that they can enter the world of work and start their own business in a way that transforms lives and communities. In this regard, we have also launched the Center for the Future of Work to predict, analyze, and understand the emerging new world of work. As an American inventor, Thomas Edison said, "Opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work." As pathbreakers of the African Knowledge Society, the young people in our society are part of the globe's youngest, fastest growing population. With the future success of the world hinging on the success of Africa. Let's do whatever we can now to equip them with the education, skills, and opportunities and vision needed to set the African economic miracle in place that future generations can happily reflect back on. Happy and good discussions. Thank you.
Well, it's a massive thank you to Prof. Coupe as he talks to us about an African miracle that we have the opportunity to set in place. And certainly this conversation is going to feed into that. It's my pleasure now, ladies and gentlemen, to give the floor to World Bank Country Director looking after Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa, Madame Marie-Françoise Marinelli, to put into context the significance of the Global Economic Prospects Report and the South African Economic Update Report. It's my pleasure now to open the floor to Madame Marinelli.
Thank you very much, Nosifo, and good morning and welcome to all of you for this important event for the World Bank Group and particularly for the World Bank office in Pretoria. Allow me first to thank Professor Coupe for hosting us today at this prestigious University of Pretoria, but also our distinguished panelists for accepting to share their views on how to build back the South Africa economy for better jobs and better economic outcomes. And finally, all of you who have joined us online to contribute to this very important discussion. As you are aware, the World Bank, of course, is well known for its financing. But beyond the financing, one of the strengths of the institution as a global institution is its capacity to bring global knowledge, bring solid analysis, and inform the policy debate, particularly in middle-income economies such as South Africa. We disseminate our knowledge in various ways, and one way we do is through our very flagship reports, and I'm pleased that today we will be presenting two of our flagship reports. The first one will be presented by my colleague Franziska Ohnsorge, who has joined us from Washington. Welcome, Franziska. And she will present the June edition of the Global Economic Prospect, which is one of our flagship reports, that focus on the global and economic prospects, but also have a technical focus each year in each edition on a specific focus. And I'm pleased to tell you that this year is the 30th anniversary of the GEP, which was launched in 1991. And we will have the opportunity, to hear from Franziska in a moment. On the technical part of this GEF, as I mentioned, as you can expect, the last three editions, because the GEF is produced biannually in January and June, the last three editions focus on COVID-19. So the first one that I'm referring to, June 20, as you know, in June 20, we were still in the middle of the pandemic. And at that time, of course, the report analyzed the deepest recession that the world experienced since World War II. And I think that at that time, we had a realization that the impact will be quite long and it will affect long-term growth. Then we had the January 2021 report that forecasted a subdued global economic growth recovery of 4%. But I think that at that time, there was also a realization that vaccine deployment and investment would be key for the recovery. And secondly, I think that there was a recognition that for all stakeholders of economic players, we were in a totally different environment. And finally, this June report that Franziska will present to us shortly will show us that actually there is a stronger recovery, but it is more uneven. It will also look at some policies for revamping, reducing trade costs to basically revamp, the global value chains. Because this report, as is global in its nature, it does not cover the impact and the analysis of economy in countries. So we do that through country publication, such as this country economic update that actually Professor Coupe already mentioned, that we present in various countries. And the country economic update actually provides the opportunity to also provide an independent view, analysis of the country economy and challenges for the benefit of various stakeholders, government, private sector, academia, as we are in the University of Pretoria, but also the international players and the population at large. It also, more importantly, allows to do benchmarking with international trends. And finally, for us, the World Bank, we think that it's important for us to reach out to the community of economists to compare notes on how we are looking at the analysis. So I am pleased to say that the report also has a technical component, and Professor Coupe, you did mention the last one who focused on higher education. But today we are coming back after an interruption of 2 years with the report that will present how the economy building back better in post-COVID with a focus on jobs for the South African economy. This is also the 10th anniversary of this report, and it is the 13th edition. For your information, a number of reports have already covered the issue of jobs, but looking at various angles, looking at, for example, the inequality dimension, the tertiary education mentioned by a professor, but also the changing demographic and private investment. We also looked at faster and more inclusive growth, looking also at the issue of competition, competitiveness, fiscal inclusion, and so forth. So this update, which was produced by my colleague, a team led by Wolfgang Fengler, will be presented shortly.
So let's start off at home. Let's start off here in South Africa. I'd like to hand over to Wolfgang and Benedicte at this moment to share with us the South Africa Economic Update Report, and thereafter we'll work our way back to Washington. So Wolfgang and Benedicte, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nosifo. I hope you hear me well, and it's such a great honor to be in this setting at this prestigious university and this professional setting, as mentioned. As you just introduced, and as said by Marie-Françoise, there's a broad team that has been leading this report. Benedicte and I will present the summary. Many South African stakeholders played a leading role, many academics, including from University of Cape Town and beyond. We already had sessions at Wits University, and this is now the peak at the University of Pretoria. And what I'll do is I'll share with you 2 overarching summary slides, then Benedicte will walk you through the macro update, and then I will conclude with the jobs perspective and the jobs analysis that we have conducted. So let me start with the main messages, the 4 main messages that we have in the report. First report, and it's actually quite topical given the president's yesterday's announcement as well, that we think, and if you look at the global perspective, that the government's crisis response has been sound. There's many challenges, there's been mistakes made like elsewhere in the world, but if you look overall in terms of the social protection response and the health response, the trade-offs that every country has between saving lives and livelihoods, the extent to which the government and the country has learned and adapted through the waves, we can conclude that South Africa did as good as it could within a lot of the challenges that is having. And the deeper economic challenges that we analyze have actually much more to do with the underlying problems that South Africa has been facing, and many of you have been reporting on, than the direct COVID response. So more what sometimes called the structural fundamentals, and Benedicte will talk through this. In this context, we do project that growth will rebound to 4% this year. Typically, that's a good number for South Africa. After 1% last year, it's a moderate rebound. So it's in the middle also of the global rebounds, and in the middle of the emerging market rebounds, and I'll show you some of the numbers in my next slide. The biggest issue, the biggest question for South Africa, in our view, is not growth this year. It will likely be in that range, and the third wave, obviously, of COVID will have an impact. The bigger question is what happens next year and the year after. Would South Africa fall back, as we now would project, to these low, moderate growth rates of the last decade, or can it engineer a much bigger takeoff, as the Vice Chancellor outlined after the analogy with the Second World War, of reviving an economic upswing and boom potentially that will actually then replicate this year's economic number, which is quote unquote just a rebound. On the challenging side is that if you look at the job situation, which, as you all know, was very challenging before COVID already, and where again the government's measures have actually helped to avoid the worst or even worse outcomes, it's those that have been fragile and vulnerable who have lost most. The wealthy workers lost income, but the poorer workers many of them lost their jobs. Some of them have recovered, but not all of them. And that's why South Africa's perennial inequality has gone worse and not better in the last year. On the positive side, and we'll talk through in the second part of our presentation, is that there's enormous potential, and the Vice Chancellor again spoke to that, of young entrepreneurs. Cape Town is becoming like a tech cluster for Africa, or the tech hub for Africa. A lot of startups, a lot of talent connected, a lot of talents active in the digital space, which actually is less affected by COVID and less affected by borders. And if South Africa would reap these opportunities of young entrepreneurship, something the World Bank is putting a lot of emphasis now as well, then it could also close what we would call the gap of self-employment, where South Africa is actually performing quite weak compared to other countries in the world and other peers, such as Turkey, Mexico, and Brazil. So that's our overall summary. So let me give you another summary slide before Benedict takes over. And this is actually a slide that's quite wonderful. I hope you like it for quickly looking at it and looking then much more deeper. And we map here how last year was and how this year is. And both years will be extreme for the world and for South Africa. Last year was one of the worst years, and this year is somehow, and Franziska will talk for this, some of the best years, but again, because it's after one of the worst years. But if you then map the world, and we did this just for easy absorption. Last year, you were already good if you were less than -4%, if you have had a mild contraction. And this year, though, most countries are, or many countries are above 4% plus or -4% plus. So then you get 4 types of countries. And actually the good news for the world is that China, US, and other countries actually didn't do as bad last year and do quite well this year. That's the place where South Africa should ideally be, in the top right corner. Africa on average is actually on the top left corner. It didn't manage the first waves quite okay last year, but now partly as a result is not growing at very high numbers, but is fragile, as we all know from the news, also beyond South Africa. There's these other countries, interestingly, Botswana is in that group, but also France, India, that very deep recession last year, but fast recovery. And South Africa is in between. South Africa had a bad year last year, as we know, and is in that middle group of medium recovery, 4% as we project. And the hope for South Africa is that it first moves to the right bottom box of a quicker recovery, and then to the top right when it would join other strong emerging markets. Here, the most relevant peer would be Vietnam. So with this, over to Benedict.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and good morning, everyone. I am Benedicte Baduel, and I will be presenting an overview of our economic outlook for South Africa. So, as we all know, the health and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on South Africa has been significant. However, it is important to note that before the pandemic hit, South Africa macroeconomic outcomes had been on a weakening trend since the global financial crisis a decade ago. So economic growth had been slowing down, and it was only 0.2% in 2019. And this resulted in real income per capita contracting since 2015. And labor markets were also deteriorated before the pandemic, with about 2 in every 5 South Africans of working age not being either in employment or education. And this trend contrasts with other emerging countries, which in general entered the pandemic from better situations. And so for South Africa, the pandemic really accelerated a trend of this deterioration. And as a result, the real income per capita is now back to close to its 2005 level, and the unemployment rate is above 30% and even above 40% according to the expanded definition. So some external factors have played a role in South Africa's trajectory, and notably the end of the commodity super cycle after the global financial crisis. However, it was mostly driven by long-standing domestic structural constraints. We can go to the next slide. And so this weakening growth trend has also been accompanied by a deterioration in public finances. The low growth translated into weak revenue, and the failure to anticipate this lasting lower growth trend implied that the committed expenditure did not adjust and translating into persistently large deficits. And as a result, public debt also rose rapidly, almost doubling between 2010 and 2019 as a share of GDP. In addition, despite the higher public expenditure, the allocation of spending was not supportive of higher growth, with a growing share of the expenditure envelope going to the interest payment bill and other categories such as public sector compensation or transfers to underperforming SOEs to the detriment of other categories, for example, capital spending. And finally, from 2017, the weak growth also translated into a negative interest growth differential, which made it even more difficult to improve public finances and stabilize debt. And so it is in this context that the COVID-19 crisis hit South Africa, and this led to a further weakening of its fiscal position. We can move to the next slide. So for 2021, we do project the South African economy to start recovering and supported primarily by a favorable global environment. Over Q1, and to some extent were data available Q2, we have seen the higher growth in trade partners and improving terms of trade translating in a rebound in activity and strong trade outcomes for South Africa. And we expect these favorable dynamics to continue to support economic growth for the remainder of the year. On the domestic front, the gradual normalization of economic activity has supported the recovery of some sectors, but others remain severely affected by the pandemic, for example, the hospitality and tourism sectors. On the demand side, we expect the domestic driver of growth to remain weak in the context of a depressed labor market, weak investment, and a tighter fiscal stance. So overall, we project growth to rebound to 4% this year. However, over the medium term, we see growth slowing to 1.5% by 2023, and this limited by long-standing constraints, including, for example, persistent load shedding. We project inflation at 4.2% this year and 4.5% annually over the medium term. In the context of higher exports driven by external demand and a more limited rebound in imports, we project another current account surplus this year before turning back into deficit from next year. On the fiscal front, based on the government's plan presented in the budget last February, we project fiscal deficits to decrease gradually to 8.4% of GDP this year and further to 6.1% of GDP by 2023. We project public debt to continue to rise over the projection period from 80% this year to just over 87% of GDP by 2023. And finally, we also expect the unemployment rate to remain elevated above or close to 30% over the projection period. So there is a lot of uncertainty around this outlook, both globally and domestically in the context of the pandemic. The evolution of vaccination programs in South Africa and worldwide, as well as the efficiency of vaccines against new variants of the COVID-19 will impact the growth outlook. And so this will shape the evolution of global growth and so external demand for South African products, but also domestically, the length and severity of the third wave and possibly subsequent waves in South Africa will impact the growth rebound over the second half of this year. The fiscal outlook is also subject to important risks. Those are related to possible higher COVID-19 related spending, higher cost of debt if global financial conditions were to change, and risk around fiscal slippages, for example, on public sector wages or support to SOEs. On the upside, the current global outlook could translate into better revenue outcome, which would support public finances and may smooth the adjustment needed to achieve the government's fiscal path. So finally, linking back to, we can go to the next slide. Linking back to the beginning of my presentation, because South Africa was on a weak growth trend before the pandemic, discussing the recovery goes beyond discussing the post-pandemic rebound. It is also about how to create the condition for sustainable, higher and more inclusive growth. So first, we think that the global outlook is broadly favorable for South Africa at the moment. The external sector can support growth post-pandemic at a time when domestic demand is weak. And this can be used as an opportunity to address the domestic constraints and create the conditions for higher growth over the medium term. So for that, structural reforms such as those, for example, envisaged in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan and supported by Operation Vulindlela would contribute to restore confidence, restart private sector investments, and ultimately boost the economy's competitiveness and productivity. And so in that context, the recent announcements of reforms on electricity generation, SAA, and the port authorities are very positive and important steps for the outlook. And finally, on the fiscal front, the priorities are to preserve macro stability and increase the effect of budget spending on the economy. So this can be done through better allocation and efficiency of budget expenditure while containing the overall envelope to rebuild fiscal space. And this will also be critical to restore confidence in public policies and avoid the crowding out of developmental expenditure. Thank you. I will pass on to Wolfgang.
Thank you very much, Benedict. So let me just give you a very brief deep dive on our jobs analysis, especially with a COVID context, but then also more broadly. And this is work again together with the academic partners in South Africa, especially University of Cape Town. If you look at the situation 2019 and each quarter, you see South Africa had a little more than 60 million people in employment, which by the way is a very low number. South Africa has 40 million adults, so that number should be potentially working adults should be much higher. But even that relatively low number of 16.2 million people in employment has, like elsewhere, suffered suffered job losses. And you see a modest recovery. So by Q2 last year, South Africa was in that worst ever employment situation, below 14.5 million. And now since then, we saw a small rebound. But still today, broadly speaking, South Africa has 1 million less jobs than it had before COVID. Now, what's interesting is if you put this number in international perspective, and this chart actually is quite nice, so I need to explain it briefly. First is how big are these bars? And you see South Africa among its peers has the lowest. So this is what was the position before COVID and even after COVID. So in terms of the share of people who work, among those who could work, South Africa, unfortunately, is very, very low. That relates to that very low, even 16 million number that I mentioned before. So only roughly 40% of South Africans were in formal employment. Very much different, say, than Thailand, Peru, Mexico, a mix of different countries, Romania, that all at least are above 50%. Then the second key message of this chart are these dots. So the lower the dot, the worse the COVID impact. So here South Africa is better than Chile, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, but it is already doing quite bad given it was so low at the beginning. And so that's what this chart communicates. Basically, the key issue is that the bar is not higher. Some countries, if you think of the US, it had very extreme COVID impact, but then a big recovery. Europe has much more muted that transition. South Africa is somewhere in the middle, but the key issue is South Africa's total share of employment is relatively low. And then it got this additional hit through COVID that is very strong. Not the most extreme, but very strong, still nevertheless. Even worse is that those who are affected by those job losses, as we said in the introduction, are actually those who are most vulnerable. And so here you have the workforce organized by income or by wealth, so to say. So the poorest is the blue line and the richest is the dark green line. But it doesn't have to be this order, but it just happens to be this order, that the rich are the least affected. So they have very mild job losses. The next group, the light green, has some job losses. The yellow has more. Blue then has a lot, and especially those vulnerable. Those who were already, having modest incomes were those who lost most of their job. Now, some has been recovered, but as you see, it's only about at 70% compared to the pre-COVID situation that the poorest have lost. And that's, as we mentioned at the beginning, is increasing inequality. And this should be one of the biggest concerns for South Africa's job market and COVID, that it's the vulnerable who lost most. And the young. So if you're young today, and say, this what's sometimes called millennial group, 15 to 24, but even the group after that has that then should be in the job market, while those 15 to 24 are still partly in a university or in education, you see very, very high numbers of unemployment or underemployment. That's basically the difference between the strict and the expanded definition. And so while we can debate those quote unquote millennials who are still partly in education, a number of 50% unemployed or not in employment in any form of those 25 to 34 is an extraordinary high number. And that again has been particularly affected by COVID. And so it's the poorer segments and it's this young potential entrepreneurs we'll talk about that have been the most affected by the crisis, are the most vulnerable today. Now, there is a few structural glimmers of hope in South Africa. One is what some would call demographic opportunity. What's somehow hidden underneath the headlines, which is often around bad news and about challenging news, is that actually fertility in South Africa has declined a lot. And so the average family size today is smaller than it was 20 years ago. And the number of children, which are modeled down that yellow line, has actually reached a peak. So the number of children, even though we all love children and want to be around children, is actually not growing anymore in South Africa. So the South African population is growing because people live longer and there's more, as a result, working adults. It's also a recovery from the AIDS epidemic. So another big epidemic that South Africa, despite a lot of challenges, has, one would say, at least contained. And that brings more potential workers, that brings more potential employers, that brings more potential entrepreneurs. But it's an opportunity that needs to be used. If it's not used, then there's more frustrated, unemployed young youth. And if it's used, it could be the engine of a recovery that is actually, as the Vice Chancellor said, not so dissimilar to what happened in Asia. So that's a structural undercurrent, what's happened in South Africa, that we actually see as principally positive, but no guarantee. This is my last visual slide before I conclude. And again, highlighting a key challenge for South Africa. And it's that the fact that entrepreneurship and self-employment is extremely low. And it's unusually low. It's only lower actually in more advanced economies where, it's either you have a formal job and you have large companies that still are very, dynamic and growing, and you then get a job there, or you may work in the public sector, but somehow that dynamic that you see often in other African countries of self-employment, the dynamism sector that you see in Asia or in Africa, including in many other countries that South Africa compares itself with, and you have Chile on the very extreme, or Mexico, South Africa is very low, 10% compared to 30%. And if South Africa would match its peers, this upper middle income peers in terms of entrepreneurship and self-employment, unemployment would be half. That would be roughly the estimate that we have for the entrepreneurship and self-employment sector. Now, as we mentioned, there is hope and there is dynamism in especially often Cape Town is referred to as the tech hub of Africa. Has 88 million of investments last year, and despite a COVID year, more than R1 billion, 450 tech firms employing 40,000 people, a relatively good ranking, unlike other parts of South Africa in doing business, and also very strong in the emerging capital base, because in the end, it's a lot about venture capital and the credibility of those networks that come with venture capital. And last but not least, strong universities are feeding that opportunity, because it's often university graduates in not just in tech, but in data science, in economics, who then form these companies, and including from University of Pretoria, that basically feed this new entrepreneurship ecosystem in South Africa. So with this, let me conclude with three more high-level recommendations that stem from our analysis, but also from international analysis. Coming back to our very first message, South Africa has managed the crisis relatively well, also because its social protection system is strong and has delivered fast. It's expensive, as we highlighted in another report, but it has delivered. The poor and those affected have benefited. What would be needed is to strengthen more the links to the labor market. And again, there has been some success, I would say. The ETI, employment tax incentives, the TERS, temporary employment relief scheme, are actually good by international standards, and other countries are using those methods to maintain employment or to create incentives for employment. There are some regulations that are very much geared towards maintaining the status quo and avoiding that new entrants in the labor force enter. And that's why many suggested, not just from our side, that a moratorium on some specific regulations, say if you're running a restaurant, your priority should now be to trying to get labor no matter what, and to open the restaurant and find some ways after the wait is over, and to focus on those who are not in the workforce and trying to engage them. And last but not least, it's linked to that theme on entrepreneurship. South Africa, again, is not in the worst position, but it could be in a much better position if it makes it even easier to do business, to enhance the mobility, zoning laws. We have a full box on actually in our report, box 2.2, that it gave illustrations of how that emerging plant actually that we saw at the beginning of the last video of entrepreneurship in South Africa could be blossoming and benefiting more if it would be even easier to open a business, to run a business, eventually to close a business, and to create that ecosystem of entrepreneurship in South Africa and beyond. With this, thank you again very much from the team of the University of Pretoria and the broader economic team that I was working with. Back to you, Nosifo.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang and Benedict, for the South African economic update. Certainly some insights that are going to give us a lot to chew on and to think about with the panelists that are going to be coming up shortly in a panel discussion, really responding to some of the insights that the report has shared with us, but contextualizing them, as many of these voices are practitioners in different spaces and sectors in South Africa. We are going to try and make our way back to Franziska in Washington to get that Global Economic Prospects report. But before I do, I still have Prof. Coupe with me in studio. And Prof, I just want to maybe just bring what you've heard right now around some of the suggestions around how might we begin to rejuvenate the economy, how might we begin to breathe life into the labor market once again in South Africa. And given the context that even today, we know that there's a lot of unrest in South Africa, especially around unemployment and jobs at the moment. And you spoke about an African economic miracle. In your view, what needs to be true for us to really make that miracle a reality, but that it be a miracle that comes with jobs and not just economic growth, but jobs as well?
No, I think what we heard was very interesting and also deeply insightful. But also, it's also true that it is not new. We know some of these things already. And I think the big question is, what are we going to do about it? What I liked about the two presentations now is that they actually show us that they are building blocks. and that those building blocks are what we should, if you like, elevate in order to be able to actually take a step forward towards creating jobs and creating sustainable jobs and jobs of the future in order to create an inclusive economy. Because we can't continue with this exclusion. That is why I referred in my talk about the Center for the Future of Work we have created at the University of Pretoria at the back of the Nobel Prize dialogues we held here for the first time. And the topic was the future of work. So what we heard from the future of work is very much dependent on one thing we have, a demographic dividend, the young people we have. But we have to educate them, train them in skills related to jobs of the future. And for me, technology, entrepreneurship, being ready for work, removing structural constraints where there are real constraints and not imagined ideological disputes, I think is the way forward.
Certainly a way forward that we're going to be testing in the panel discussion. The building blocks are there, says Prof. Coupe. Now it is about taking those decisions and getting them into action. Back to Washington we go, where Franziska is standing by to give us the Global Economic Prospects Report. Franziska, let's open the virtual floor to you once again.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? I hope so. Very good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this launch of the South Africa Economic Update, and apologies for the technical difficulties. So if you think back 30 years ago, in 1991, the global economy was in a deep recession. And that's why this report, this Global Economic Prospects Report, was started to show how emerging markets and developing economies suffer when there is a big global recession. And here we are again, 30 years later, and we're coming just out of yet another global recession, which was the deepest in the last 8 decades, actually, since the Second World War. But its recovery has also been the strongest in 8 decades, essentially in a lifetime. We are in an incredibly strong global recovery. The problem with this recovery is that it has also been exceptionally uneven. It's left the poorest countries behind. It's been very much a two-speed kind of recovery. So as backdrop, to show you, global trade has rebounded very quickly from the pandemic, much faster than after the global financial crisis. By November last year, 7 months after the trough of the global economy, in April, global goods trade was already back to pre-pandemic levels, something that took 19 months, not 7 months after the global financial crisis. Services trade globally has also rebounded, and by March it was within 3% of the pre-pandemic levels, despite tourism and travel services being 65% below pre-pandemic levels. We've had a few financial market jitters for a few months ago, but they dissipated quickly. And commodity prices, I realize commodities are important to the South African economy. Commodity prices have rebounded sharply, much faster than after the global financial crisis, and most are now well above pre-pandemic levels. And all that have just been symptoms of an exceptionally strong global rebound in global growth. You see in the chart on the left, the real GDP path, the path of global real GDP through all the past 6 global recessions since the Second World War. That's the shade. The blue line in the chart on the left is the current real GDP in the current global recession. You can see that this rebound from the 2020 global recession is the strongest in a lifetime, in 8 decades. We now project that global growth in 2021 will be the fastest in almost 50 years. We have to go back to the early 80s. Global per capita growth in 2021 will be the fastest in about 70 years. You have to go back to the 1930s to see this kind of global per capita growth that we're seeing now. It's much stronger than what we had anticipated in January, in large part because since then, the US has announced a bigger stimulus package than we had anticipated at the time, or that was possible to anticipate at the time. And in advanced economies, at least, the vaccination rollout has also progressed faster than we had anticipated. But, and this is what the 2 other charts here show you, this rebound has also been exceptionally uneven across advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies. Here in the chart in the center, the red bar, you can see that 90% of advanced economies are expected to return to their pre-pandemic per capita income levels next year. In the chart on the right, you see that that's barely 40% of emerging markets and developing economies, less than after any global recession in 8 decades. That's what we mean with the most uneven rebound in a lifetime in 8 decades. And this uneven recovery has implications for income conversions towards advanced economy per capita incomes. Until the pandemic, LICs and fragile states and small states were converging towards advanced economy per capita incomes, or at least in the case of fragile states, they were keeping up with them. Over the next 3 years, however, they'll increasingly fall behind, as you can see here in the chart on the left, at the pace of about 1 to 4% a year. And that's really bad news for the 40% of the world's extreme poor who live in low-income countries, and the additional 15% of the world's poor who live in non-low-income countries, fragile states. And in the chart on the right, you can see that those EMDE regions that fell behind advanced economies, that did not converge towards advanced economy per capita incomes over the past decade, will also be the ones that will not converge or that will fall behind at a faster pace over the next 3 years. Even before the pandemic, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa, and in this case, particularly importantly, Sub-Saharan Africa, per capita incomes are increasingly falling behind advanced economy per capita incomes. And the pace at which they're now falling behind over the next 3 years is expected to accelerate to 1 to 3% per year over the next 3 years. Again, these 3 regions account for 74% of the world's extreme poor. Things are a bit better in the other regions, but only in a very half-glass full kind of way. In ECA, convergence will, in Europe and Central Asia, ECA, convergence will essentially stall. And in Asia, in the 2 Asias, East Asia and South Asia, convergence will continue, but at a slower pace than before the pandemic. And for Sub-Saharan Africa, these prospects mean that per capita incomes in 2023, here, the red line in this chart, will still be below pre-pandemic levels. By that time, advanced economies, the blue line here, EMDEs, the orange line here, and even low-income countries as a whole, the green line here, will already have recouped their per capita income losses from the pandemic. And all of that is in a baseline scenario. So if none of the risks to the outlook materialize, the events in India, Latin America, and even some advanced economies have been a reminder that the pandemic is not yet under control. Even with the rollout of vaccines, new variants can still spread and trigger yet another wave of outbreaks and lockdowns. And in addition, there is the perennial risk of financial market stress derailing the recovery. And EMDEs are currently particularly vulnerable to that because of record high debt. And I'll return to that in the next slide. And then there's a group of risks that affects subgroups of countries. Food insecurity is a big issue in the poorer countries and low-income countries and fragile states. Geopolitical risks are a problem in some parts of Asia and parts of Middle East and North Africa. Climate-related risks are big risks, especially for the smaller countries and the tourism-related reliant countries and island economies. So let me return to one of the risks I just touched on, the possibility of financial market stress. One potential cause for financial market stress is concern over rising inflation in some major advanced economies. You may have read the headlines over the last 2-3 months about the US inflation rising to very high levels compared to recent past. Now, of course, some increase in inflation was to be expected in the strong global recovery. That's just what happens in global recoveries. But this latest global recession and its recovery were different from previous ones. You can see in the chart on the left here, that's global inflation, the blue line, and advanced economy inflation in the red line, and the orange line, emerging market and developing economy inflation. You can see that the inflation declined, but only between January and April. And then it started picking up again. This inflation decline during the recession of last year was more muted and shorter lived than in any previous global recession in the past half century. You can see that in the chart in the center, where we show you all the inflation developments, global inflation developments, in all the past global recessions for which we have data, so since the 70s. You can see the red line is the current global recession and its recovery. You could barely make out that there was a decline in inflation, and you can see that the rebound was almost immediate. And this inflation recovery or rebound from April last year, April-May last year, was very broad-based. It's affected 4/5 of the global economy. It's not just a phenomenon of the United States where we read it in the news. It was in more than 80% of the countries inflation has been picking up since the middle of last year. And for 2021, there's every reason to expect higher inflation. In fact, we did an econometric exercise and we looked at surveys, and they all point to an increase in global inflation between 2021 and 2020 of somewhere between 1 and 1.5 percentage point. By itself, an increase of that magnitude would leave inflation within target bands for virtually all advanced economies and about half of the inflation targeting emerging markets. Even for other emerging markets and developing economies, where inflation would rise above target bands, there may not be any reason for concern under two conditions, provided it's temporary. This overrun is temporary, and provided that inflation expectations remain well anchored. And at the aggregate level, this is what it looks like at the moment. If you look at the chart on the right, the blue lines show you consensus inflation forecast for EMDs as a whole for this year. And yes, inflation is expected to pick up this year. That's just what's to be expected. But look at the red line, and that's really the core of the story. The red line has hardly moved. Those are 5-year ahead, medium-term inflation forecasts for EMDs as a whole at the aggregate level. You can see how flat they are. So for now, at the aggregate level, indications are that this year's inflation increase will fade as the recovery cools, and for many individual emerging markets and developing economies. Of course, such an inflation increase complicates monetary policy. And if this was all accompanied by financial market jitters, because investors become concerned about advanced economy inflation, emerging markets and developing economies would be very vulnerable to financial market stress simply because debt is now at record highs. It's already built up that much over the last decade and has gotten much higher in the last year. So while the immediate policy priority, of course, remains to bring the pandemic to an end, EMDEs, emerging markets and developing economies, are increasingly having to juggle these competing macroeconomic policy challenges to support the recovery, so support growth, while also supporting or preserving stability, price stability, fiscal stability, and financial stability. And at the same time, having to put in place reforms that build the foundation for future growth. And we look at this in much greater detail at one element, one way of supporting growth, of boosting growth over the medium term, which is to encourage trade by lowering trade costs. The bulk of trade costs is not tariffs. The bulk of trade costs is in shipping costs and logistics costs. There's a lot countries can reform. This is developed much more in much greater detail, as Marie-Françoise already said, in the Global Economic Prospects report you see at the top. So that's on the external side, how to boost growth. But there are also measures that can be implemented on the domestic side to boost domestic growth. And some of these are detailed in our new study of the long shadow of informality. And I encourage you to have a look at it. And with this, I very much look forward to the rest of discussion. Thank you.
It's a massive thank you to you, Franziska, from Washington, giving us, of course, the global economic prospects. And of course, linking that very well to the South Africa economic update. And we're really getting a good picture of the linkage and the parallels between recovery in the global economy and what that could mean for South Africa as we also seek to recover from this global pandemic and, of course, recover in a way that produces jobs but also delivers an inclusive economy. I do want to just thank all of you online that have begun to send us questions and comments. I am going to try to the best of my ability to integrate your voice into the conversation as much as possible. And of course, there has been a question as well about the actual report. We will be circulating after this event to all of those who did attend an email that has the link to this recording so that you can watch it once more, but also has the South African Economic Update report as well as the Global Prospects report so that you are able to go through those at your own leisure. Now, I am going to move on to our panel discussion, and there are three focus areas in particular that I really want us to bring into sharp focus as we have this conversation. We're going to be digging into the impact of COVID-19 and the government's response. We're going to bring into sharp focus growth and economic reform, as has been suggested by our colleagues from the World Bank Group, as well as jobs and entrepreneurship, which of course was positioned as one of the strongest ways in which we can recover from this pandemic. And so it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce my panelists right now. We are joined by Trudy Makaya. She is the economic advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa, and we thank her very much for her time. We're also joined by Dr. Adrian Eindhoven. He is an executive chairman of Yellowwoods, as well as a non-executive director on the board of Business Leadership South Africa. He also is the deputy chairman of the Solidarity Fund, which is quite important in the context of where we find ourselves, and also co-chairs the Millennial Labour Council. So a massive thank you and welcome to AD for joining us today. Professor Heinrich Bollmann is with me in studio. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria. Thank you very much, Prof, for making the time to be here. And last but certainly not least, and very important in this conversation, is Ms. Tessa Dooms. She is a Commissioner for Youth in the National Planning Commission and really will be bringing her voice in to really bring in a youthful lens and insights into the conversation. And as always, of course, please do send us your questions and your comments. Trudy, I'm going to maybe kick this off with a question to you, and it's a reflective view, if you will. And maybe just to ask you, at a high level highlight, what were the major efforts from the government during the pandemic? More importantly, what impact did these have on creating buffers to the shocks that the labor market was being exposed to in the last 18 months or so? Trudy?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and good day to your audience. I think we began with a very clear recognition at the beginning, in the early phases of the pandemic, that we're going to have a strain on economic activity, and so we must ensure that households and firms are supported. So the report, the economic update, has a nice summary of all the interventions that we undertook in terms of topping up social welfare grants, creating a special grant for adults who would not have been part of the social safety net before then, and many others. But I think what I want to focus on is actually the impact of all of these interventions, because we've seen, for instance, from work coming out of the NIDS National Income Dynamic Survey, that there's been hunger would have been much worse had we not had these interventions. So we still have high levels of hunger than we typically would, but the counterfactual would have been much worse. We also see that many businesses were able to re-engage with their employees and to maintain relationships in a way that they wouldn't have been able to had they had to rely on their own cash flows. We also had a what we call an employment stimulus, where we created job opportunities, some of them admittedly short-term, but to ensure that people are able to gain skills during this crisis, are able to be part of the COVID-19 response, and in so doing can support their livelihoods, but also can increase their employability after this. So if we had about 700,000 opportunities which were created during this time. Now, we know our fiscal challenges, but I think we still found a way to do this without necessarily getting off that path towards consolidation that we will get back on and ensure that within the next 5 years, we're able to stabilize our deficit. But I think those interventions were probably useful in also ensuring that we do have the green shoots in economic recovery that we're seeing. So you would have seen, you know, it's been mentioned, we've had a trade surplus, we've had a current account surplus. We've regained some of the jobs that we've lost, even if not all of them. We've seen our financial markets holding up. Our banks have not had any significant incidents that would cause any worry. But I think to end this reflection, it also says something about our economy, that one of the key elements of that economic package was support for small business. Some of the support was in terms of being given, you know, payment holidays for pay as you earn and for taxes. And that was taken up, and also being given grants and financing through the small business department, through the tourism fund, and many others. But there was also a big part, which was a guarantee given to banks to ensure that they give credit to small businesses and all businesses in general. But it started with smaller businesses, and then it was expanded to cover all businesses. And what we saw from that was that the take-up has been very low. And there's this divergence in the business world where there are established companies, some of them very mature, that have had long-standing relationships with banks, which were able to take advantage of some of the concessions that the banks themselves gave. And then there were more fragile and vulnerable small businesses which were not able, which did not qualify for some of that support because they would have already come into the pandemic with a bad credit record or with inconsistent payments, and so fell out from that level of support. And I think it does tell us that going forward, we have to ensure that, you know, both segments of entrepreneurship, the established, but also, you know, and I mean, I'm not talking about informal, but I'm talking about more formal, but still vulnerable. You know, some of your restaurants, your hospitality industries, some of your startups, your clothing firms. You know, we've seen across the board that the younger, more vulnerable companies have not been able to sustain themselves during this period. So it is quite a lesson. But I think overall, we're able to have the kind of recovery that we're seeing starting to emerge because of a strong response in terms of supporting households. If you look at the sectors that have managed to lead the recovery, you know, there's a broad range. You have agriculture, which obviously also didn't suffer from as much restrictions, but you also have mining, you also have services coming back. So we still have that broad base of economic activity that we can build on. And I think as is universally agreed, vaccination is an important part of that, and we're accelerating our vaccination efforts, even against the backdrop of a difficult supply environment in terms of getting hold of doses. I think I'll leave it there.
Trudy, I think it's a beautiful place to open up the conversation. And of course, you're giving us some reflective insights to think about what have we done and how has it led to some of the green shoots and some of the early recoveries that we are beginning to see. A quick question from the audience, and this one would have been expected given the president's report last night, but how much of a risk is some of the political disruption that we are seeing now to the economic recovery? For example, the disruption to some of the trade routes right now. A quick comment on that, please, Trudy.
So we're doing all we can to ensure that the disruptions are minimized. Of course, that begins with arresting criminals, intervening in those hotspots where we're seeing challenges. And, you know, some of this has obviously been on government's radar for a while. Most of your audience will probably be aware of the situation at Rio Tinto, for instance, where we've had the premier, we've had the national and also the provincial police commissioners and the security cluster more broadly putting together a strategy to deal with that. So we have a model of how you can go into a community, both from a stakeholder management, but also from a real strong law enforcement and crime detection and prevention perspective. Obviously, at the moment, these flare-ups are happening across the country. So there is strain on the system, but we are convening all the parties and all the stakeholders to come to one plan and ensure that we don't have disruptions that we're seeing at the moment.
For that, of course, speaking into the top of mind issues as well. Adi, I'm going to come to you again, and just in context of the fact that we saw that in response to the pandemic, South Africa implemented what many have described as one of the most severe lockdowns on the continent. And yet, Adi, despite these measures, we did see the economy shrinking by about 7% in 2020. More importantly, for this conversation, low-income workers were the most affected. Maybe with the benefit of hindsight, Adi, a comment from you on what do you think government could have done differently, but also what could business and other social partners in partnership with government done differently for a better outcome?
Thanks, Nazipa. I mean, I think the point you make is a very important one, that this crisis was completely unprecedented, and there was no tried and tested formula or textbook about how one should respond to it. So I think it is important, before talking about what the lessons are and what we could have done differently, just to recognize that I think that there was a lot that was done by both business and government that was done well. I think by global standards, our government responded well to this crisis, was led by science. I think there was a very strong coordination of the national response. If you look at how government worked with their social partners through NEDLAC, through Business for South Africa, the establishment of the Solidarity Fund, which I think is globally a kind of standout example of how government, business, and civil society can come together to unify their response and mobilize resources for to deal with the crisis. And some of the things that have been mentioned around the allocation of spectrum and the VAT relief for zero-rated goods, extended social grants. I think there's a lot done to help support businesses and households. I think in the early stages of the lockdown, I think one of the lessons that was learned was one needs to kind of simplify. There was a lot of regulatory complexity in the early stages. I think what we should say about our lockdowns by global comparison is that apart from the very hard, level 5 lockdown we had in the beginning, there has been a very kind of measured and balanced response to how to, as was mentioned in the World Bank report, kind of balance lives and livelihoods, and we haven't had those, the severity of that early stage lockdown, since then. And I think that the issues around the kind of regulatory complexities, especially in the first lockdown, level 4, we haven't seen those reoccur. But I think simplifying kind of the regulations around lockdowns is something that we've learned, and something that we could have maybe have done with the benefit of hindsight, better earlier on. I think the big area that could have been improved on is on the procurement side, and particularly how you deal with procurement in the context of a crisis. And obviously the two areas that come to mind are the PPE procurement and vaccine procurement. I think on the business side, the speed of securing PPE, putting protocols in place, from my experience at the Solidarity Fund, and witnessing this at Business for South Africa, there was the mobilization of vast pro bono resources from business, both in funds and services and seconded people, to help support government and the Solidarity Fund to deal with the crisis. I think that where business could possibly have been more focused is in helping to support the health response, particularly, and there was some business response in adding hospital bed capacity, but I think also in kind of infection risks outside of the workplace, particularly in areas like public transport, and maybe more that business could have done to help flatten the curve.
Adi, I think it's a fantastic response, and bringing in all of those social actors into play. I've got a quick question here that's coming from our live audience, Adi, and the question is, the Oppenheimer Fund had a good take-up, but it was exhausted in April 2020. And the question is, why did the government not replenish this? Now, I know, Adi, you're not government by any means, but I think that at the core of this question is, could we be running out of partnership optimism and the desire to work together between government and business, especially again when one takes into consideration the fact that we are seeing a lot of attacks on retail shops at the moment. It's not just about business confidence, but it also could be a dent in the spirit of partnership. Do you have any comment on that, AD?
So I don't think, certainly at a national level, there's any kind of dent in the partnership. In fact, I think we should recognize that. I mean, business and government of labor have never worked as closely as they have. I think over the last 18 months historically. I think this has been unprecedented, and hopefully, if you look at the Solidarity Fund as an example, I think this hopefully bodes for a new way for business, civil society, and business. I mean, so government, civil society, and business to work together to solve some of South Africa's challenges. I mean, I think in relation to the specific question on the Oppenheimer Fund, I mean, the Oppenheimer Fund was essentially designed to address the problem of workers being retrenched from businesses, and essentially about kind of livelihoods of workers. And I think if you look at the government response, it may not have been in replenishing that fund, but I mean, there was a very significant response by government to support households. It was just, in a different form.
So we have found new ways of working together, and potentially in unprecedented ways. Adi, I'm going to circle back to you with more questions, but for now, let me go to Hendrik, Prof. Bolman, who is with me here in studio. Prof, COVID-19, the crisis, one of the things that it exposed was the widening inequality due to severe and unequal job losses that have happened at this time. More importantly, we saw low-wage workers suffering almost 4 times more job losses than high-wage workers. At least this is what we are gleaning from the World Bank report. And so, Prof, the question to you is, what needs to be true in South Africa for a real job recovery to really be a reality for all, and emphasis on all?
Yes, a complete answer to this question has many layers, and will probably take longer to unpack than we have time for. Luckily, my colleagues on the panel have already touched on some of those important aspects. But allow me to first take a step back before answering the specific question. Pre-COVID, South Africa already had some of the highest unemployment and inequality rates in the world. Many reports, including this one, have devoted time to this issue over the last 2 decades. Our tragic state of affairs was further exacerbated by the pandemic and lockdown regulations, as discussed in the report as well. So when we are discussing a recovery, where do we want to recover to? The truth is we need much more than a recovery from COVID. We need a recovery from a social and labour market situation that's been untenable for as long as I'm sure many of us can remember. So where do we start? What needs to be true, as you said, for this recovery to become a reality? It must be understood that sustainable jobs are the result of sustainable economic activity. In normal times, in normally functioning economies, governments are not expected to fulfill this task, but merely help facilitate it through ensuring key institutions function well, ensuring the cost of business is low, and intervening through smart regulations where markets fail or produce socially unacceptable outcomes. Unfortunately, South Africa has not ranked well in international comparisons across these key categories: quality of institutions and ease of doing business. With institutions, we of course mean the rules of the game and how society engages with each other, regulations and customs. These interactions, think rule of law, freedom of the press, independence of key institutions, property rights. The State Capture project, of course, played a large part in eroding the quality of our institutions and harming the social compact and trust between government and society at large, including investors. Burdensome regulations and red tape for those wanting to start a new business, combined with poor service delivery, have increased the effective cost of doing business and discouraged new potential investors, contributing to a key point highlighted in the report: South Africa's low levels of self-employment and entrepreneurial activity. Following an economic crisis like this, there is usually room for a larger role for government to help stimulate the economy, protect incomes and save or even create jobs that would otherwise have been lost. While such interventions are important and necessary in the short term, they have typically proven unsustainable for governments in the long term, and we really need to start thinking beyond the short term. What government can do and should focus on is help create the incentives and regulatory environment for the private sector, including individual, small firms and big firms, to build back better, bigger and more competitively. It must be viewed as a trustworthy and reliable partner and facilitator for both capital and labour to achieve success. Strong institutions the cornerstone of successful economies and most important determinant for overall productivity, must be more than something on paper. It must be real. It must be felt by the average person on the street, the trust and confidence of a government that works for us and leads from the front in terms of upholding and strengthening our institutions. That is what must be real for the recovery to go beyond the damage of COVID, strong institutions. There are not many things economists agree on, but the importance and primacy of institutions in affecting the overall quality of life of a country's citizens is certainly one of those. If this is achieved and confidence and trust in our government regained following the damage done during the state capture era, the jobs will return. Why? Because investors and potential business owners will then again see South Africa as a place to put their money, hire and develop productive labor, build and invent things, and hopefully help this country reach its potential.
Thank you very much, Hendrik, for that response. I mean, one of the things that you've said that have really caught my attention is talking about how that recovery must be real. It must be really felt. And so as I come to Tessa now for the next question, I really want to stress test, how do we make it real and tangible? Now, Tessa, one of the things that we pick up from the economic update is that it points out that young entrepreneurs in South Africa's emerging startup sector are probably the country's best hope for a jobs-rich future. What practical interventions do you think are likely to unlock the sector to really become a driver of employment? And as Prof. Bowman says, such that the reality of a recovery is real and can be really felt by those in small and medium-sized businesses as well. Tessa?
Thank you so much for the question. I think we need to start answering that question by thinking about the character of the private sector in South Africa. And when we conjure up ideas of what the private sector is, and especially if you look in the ways that things like relief are structured, and our characterization of kind of where jobs will come from or what support is needed, we often think about it in a very narrow sense. We think about the private sector as formal sector, big business in the main, and then we kind of think about everybody else as kind of secondary to that big formal sector structure that we think of as the private sector. And you see this in multiple ways. You see it in the ways in which these partnerships and stakeholders are structured. It's very rare that you see small businesses on their own really represented in those forums where government is engaging. It's very rare that you see the informal sector and the informal economy, which makes up millions of people in the country, really participating in these conversations and being seen as legitimate stakeholders. And so our first step must be to recharacterize what we think of as the private sector. I work a lot in the NGO sector and in social entrepreneurship. And again, that's another part of our economy, where people are working, where people are contributing, where people are economically active. And we don't think of them as stakeholders, as part of the economic story of the country and part of where our economic activity needs to come from. And this is important because, especially for young people, this is where their terrain is. Their terrain is in the informal sector. Many people say that youth unemployment is very high in this country. But as somebody who works in the youth sector, I can tell you that I'm yet to meet young people who are doing nothing every day in this country. They're young people who are always on the hustle. They're always doing things to make sure they have some kind of income. And whether those things are sustainable or unsustainable is not only up to them, it's also up to us. We are not taking seriously and valuing the things that people are doing. The social economy, the care economy in this country, we've had a history in this country, and we see it on a daily basis, even in negative ways sometimes, how community activists are the ones who keep those communities that we talk about as marginal ticking every day, rural areas, peri-urban areas. There's so much social and care work that needs to be done in our society, and young people are the ones doing it. And we need to start seeing them as real actors in the space. We need to start valuing what it is that they're doing and start nurturing them. And when we look at what's happened with the COVID period, one of the things that keeps popping up anecdotally is the idea that the 350 Rand grant was something that people were able to use, for instance, to start small businesses or to start some kind of survivalist activities. And as much as I don't like those examples very much because they point to this kind of almost a mirage, and something that's exceptional. What we actually want is we want to learn from that what people need as the bare basics to actually create a daily income. We learned from the pandemic that the moment we had lockdown, we had millions of people in this country who didn't need the 350. They needed to be out in the streets doing their informal trading and supplying to their local communities who at that point weren't able to get onto taxis and go to the local spa in the same ways that they used to. We need to understand the mechanics of the everyday micro activities that are going on and not separate that from the macroeconomic conversations that we are having. And the final way in which we've seen the need to engage with the private sector and economic activity differently in this country, based on what happened during lockdown, is we really saw that what became the heart and soul of this country really was in the NGO space. And we really saw people really banding together, coming together, and being the thing that held their communities together. Valuing that kind of work is imperative. We've seen with the presidential employment stimulus package, bringing in young people, for instance, into the school system as assistant teachers, as one of those kind of social economy interventions. If we took that to every other level, if we thought about that in terms of infrastructure, if we thought about that in terms of hospitals, how many people could we be putting into the economy and making economically active while doing development work as well? There are many aspects to the ways in which young people are getting involved in our country that we need to start valuing better so that we can have a more comprehensive conversation about the private sector and how we actually get involved.
Tessa, I think it's an excellent answer. I do want to test something with you that Trudy said in the beginning of her contribution. She spoke about this divergence that we saw in actual support for businesses from the banks, where she spoke about established businesses as having more access to some of the concessions and therefore, of course, monopolizing that space. And we saw micro and small businesses that have otherwise coming into that conversation with banks, oftentimes without a credible credit record and the like, but not really being able to tap into some of those concessions. In your view, how do we close that gap? How do we get rid of that divergence? And when we are creating concessions, and if government is leading those concessions, we're ensuring that they are accessible to a much broader spectrum of business.
Yeah, I think the normative answer to that would be formalize everybody and put them into entrepreneurship incubation programs and, whip them into shape. And my response is slightly different to that. While that might be the end goal, it cannot be the place where we start. And so, Trudy spoke very, very well about the loan system that was in the banks. The one that I actually kept my eye on was the one that came from the Department of Small Business Development, which wasn't going through the banks. And there you had, even within government itself, just regulations and criteria that was very exclusionary of people in the informal sector and of small businesses that are starting up. We know that it's not only the cost of doing business generally in this country that is high, it is also the burden of the red tape and the amount of money it takes, for instance, just as a small business that is starting out, to make sure that you have audited financial statements if you want to go and get a loan from the banks or from financial development institutions or government itself. I mean, I was working with a social entrepreneur organization in Cliftown recently, who was literally asked by government itself to give audited financial statements for an organization that does not bring in even 10,000 to 20,000 Rand. And so how do you then balance those things out? You balance it out by going to the basics and saying, what are people actually doing and how do we respond to that? As opposed to setting a threshold and then trying to get people to meet that threshold by hook or by crook. There are many people in this country who refuse to register their businesses formally because they realize that the burden of doing so, either in human resources or in capital, will just make it difficult for them to maintain it anyway. We need to address that as a systemic issue rather than continue to place the burden on the young person, on the entrepreneur to reach it. And the same thing is actually true if you think about the jobs market in South Africa generally, in terms of formal employment of young people. One of the studies that I did when I was still in the National Planning Commission, which I'm not in anymore, but one of the studies that we did really looked at the question of the demand side of the labor market and the ways in which young people are not actually getting into the kind of jobs that are available for reasons that have got nothing to do with their own competence. It's also about the way we structure our economy, the way we structure jobs. Are we making them friendly to the young people who are out there and need them? Are we thinking about reducing the cost of transport? Are we thinking about reducing the cost of internet? Are we thinking about creating job youth-friendly environments that nurture and train young people in the ways that you would an artisan, and takes young people along a journey where you can then eventually employ them because you've built your own timber? We must look at the demand side and ask hard questions of not only government, but of private sector and big business as well, and ask, what are you willing to do to change the way we operate our economy so that we have more inclusivity, rather than asking people to continue to meet standards that they clearly are not meeting?
Tess, I think it's a lovely way to pass this baton of asking the difficult questions back to Trudy. Trudy, as we now move from the reflective frame and begin to look forward, the question to you is, which reforms do you think, or does the government believe, are going to support an economic rebound, more specifically for the context of this conversation, are going to positively impact the labor market? I'd be keen to also hear from you if there are specific sectors that you think are really going to launch us towards a higher growth trajectory that delivers more jobs, and if you could highlight some of those for us.
Thank you so much. I think maybe just going back to an earlier question, I think what I also didn't mention in terms of the crisis response, I mean, to the current violent protests, is that we've now started pre-deployment procedures to get the SNDF to support the law enforcement agencies in dealing with some of the hotspots. Of course, this is a deployment that is in line with the Constitution and is meant to support law enforcement and to maintain peace and security. So the emphasis is on that, and not to, obviously, not to escalate the situation. So I thought I should just round that up in terms of more immediate information. Now, in terms of the reforms in the economy, I think one of the things we've seen is that there have been long-standing issues that, you know, policies that have just been stuck or where they've been impasses, and we've tried to resolve these. And some of them take for many years. For instance, you know, you'd have seen when the president announced the reforms to make ports more competitive, through, you know, beginning with reforms at Transnet and its structure and how it shapes the industry. You know, some of those reforms had been on the books for the past 10 to 15 years. This was the decision taken more than 10 years ago, and that is only being implemented now. There are a lot of those, you know, even on the spectrum end, releasing that digital dividend. We're only seeing a movement now, but this has been an ongoing issue, including on digital migration. This has been on the books for more than 15 years. So I think there's been that agenda of just doing simple things that most people actually don't disagree upon. No one says these are bad policy ideas, but often they get stuck with vested interests about how to do them, or, you know, which methodology to roll out something, who should get the work to roll out a particular work program. I think that's where things have stuck in the past, and now we're resolving some of that. Some of it also just has to do with the capacity of the state, where it hasn't always been well organized, and so things just take too long for decisions to be taken, and we're also working on that. So I think the point that was made about institutions being very important to economic growth really stands, and it's something that the president has taken to heart, that the state has to be efficient, take good decisions, not be mired in vested interests, and actually get moving. Now, when it comes to job creation, as I mentioned earlier, part of the crisis, the economic crisis response, was to create short-term opportunities, but a lot will depend on labor market recovery driven by the economy itself, generating opportunities, which is why making the economy work better is also an important part of the agenda. So a lot has been put into infrastructure development. There's been a fund that's been set up, and the point of the fund is not just that government is putting money in it, but also that it will draw money from the private sector to drive certain catalytic projects. And we've seen some of them already being launched. There's been bridge building, rural bridges that are being built across the country, rural roads, and other maintenance of the road network that needs to happen. That work has gone out. But there are also bigger projects that are meant to make the economy more efficient. There's a port revitalization project, which will also draw a significant amount of funds. Those projects have been packaged, and some of them have been gazetted, the priority ones that are meant to really drive the economy and get it going. Some of those infrastructure projects, of course, have a strong private sector elements, such as the residential developments that the president has launched, some of the automotive projects like the Ford hub in Pretoria, Mercedes-Benz in the Eastern Cape, various industrial sites in KwaZulu-Natal. So, infrastructure is going to be a big theme, and also doing it right, because of course Medupi and Kusile were also infrastructure, but that wasn't done right. So it's about doing it right and coming in at the right cost, and also going out of our way to link it to local communities in ensuring that they get procurement, they're part of the decisions that are being taken, and that they, the enterprises localization becomes a reality. The other part, of course, is on just getting our energy story right. It's been one of the biggest drags on the economy, and we've seen now with reforms, both within Eskom itself to make it more efficient. It will always have an important role to play in electricity generation. So there's no notion of trying to diminish Eskom. So getting it right, getting it to operate effectively, getting it to deal with its debt burden. Some of that has been helped by the exchange rate, by the way. Lately, they've been able to draw down some of their debt. But of course, there's got to be a bigger solution in terms of the debt. But also the electricity market as a whole, and including private players. And by private players, I like Tessa's point, it's not just about renewable international multinationals, but also trying to stimulate local municipalities to procure from local projects, even including community-owned renewable projects, to ensure that communities also see a stake for themselves in energy security. So that's a big part of the reforms. Then looking at our industrial base, the proportion of manufacturing in the economy has fallen, over the past 2 decades. And we need to arrest that. And the best way to arrest that is to integrate ourselves better into the continent. We have a lot to offer our neighbors in terms of our products. And so the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a big part of ensuring that we revitalize some of our manufacturing in machinery, industrial inputs, and also even in services, professional services that can be offered to the rest of the continent. So getting that productive base going has been important. And we've done it in partnership with the private sector, or rather with social partners. So a lot of the industry master plans that are being crafted, for instance, if you look at the textiles master plan, there's a big contribution from the labor movement in terms of certain commitments, including for them to buy locally for their own needs. There's a commitment from business to invest and also to procure locally. There's commitments from the state in terms of policies that are needed. So it's a multi-sectoral approach to these master plans to ensure that when we talk about revitalizing the economy, it's actually it speaks to realities on the ground. It's not just government planning and assuming that the country needs, so many factories or whatever. It's the private sector coming and saying, these are our investment plans, and this is how we can accelerate them if certain things are in place. So that's another big part. Now, going back to the green economy part, I think one of the things that are going to create significant job creation is getting our low emission story correct. How are we going to transition from this very heavy polluting industry that we have to a low carbon emissions one that the NDP envisages? The challenge with that is that we see lots of jobs potential in renewable energy, but also in transport, moving our production to electric vehicles or hybrids to begin with, producing green hydrogen, producing green steel, producing jet fuel that doesn't have high carbon content, because I think that's one of the big industries that are looking to go greener. So there's a whole range of opportunities where we are well poised to take advantage of that. Challenge is that often we see that there's also lots of job losses that precede that when, you know, people who are dependent on coal. And I think in the next few months, working with the Presidential Climate Change Commission, we're trying to resolve that, to say we can't just look at the promise, but we also have to have a plan on how we deal with those communities that are affected by the drawdown from coal. So that's, I think, what just recalibrating our economy in that way will ensure that we have jobs. Let me leave it at that.
Yeah, Trudy, it's a very comprehensive answer, because I do think as you were speaking, a lot of questions were coming up from our audience to say, what about this? For example, why is there no discussion on industrial policy? And of course, you then touched on industrial policy. There was a comment that says, you know, economic reform will not create jobs. There's a need for targeted investment in local industrialization. And I certainly think that some of the elements of what you shared with us could be opened up into a conversation about what would be the underlying investment that is required. One element, though, I mean, you touched on SOEs and Eskom in particular, but there was a question that said, you know, could the developments around SAA and that particular model be replicated across other SOEs? Now, one of the things I promised to my global audience here is that I'm going to create the space for their voices to be heard. But I'm going to put that question in my back pocket to you, Trudy, to say, you know, to what extent could we be replicating that model more deliberately? What I am going to do, though, is I want to go back to AD and talk a little bit about the vaccine rollout, AD, because we do know that any rebound in economic activity is aligned to the rollout and the progress of the rollout of vaccinations. Of course, we did hear the president speaking last night, speaking about the targets and how quickly we are now making more progress. But maybe the question to you is, you know, is our program comparably to other markets currently a risk, or is it an enabler towards economic recovery in your view?
I mean, Nozipa, I think we have to say in every economy, and that includes South Africa, you know, mass vaccination is absolutely kind of, you know, critical to economic recovery. So that certainly applies to us. And I think the faster we can roll out the vaccination program to as many South Africans as possible, the better. Obviously, until now, our primary constraint has been supply of vaccines. It hasn't been implementing capacity. Going forward, you know, from everything that we have heard, it seems that supply of vaccines is no longer going to be our constraint. And from what we can see at the Solidarity Fund and discussions that we've been involved in, I mean, there's huge mobilization of resources, both in government, in the private sector. You know, the Solidarity Fund is looking to support to roll out, you know, increased capacity for vaccinations. And if you just look at the increases in the number of daily vaccinations administered over the last few weeks, and there's been just a very significant increase. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to get to, you know, the levels the president was talking about, 250 or 300,000 vaccinations a day, you know, in the coming weeks. And we can then move through the, you know, the numbers of South Africans that need to be vaccinated very quickly. I think we will face challenges towards the end on the demand side, and that's something that we all need to work on.
Adi, a quick follow-up question for you from our audience, not so much on the vaccines, but really looking at the World Competitiveness Report and the outline here that says, look, if we look at that report, we do see that South Africa continues to fall in its rankings of competitiveness. How do we begin to turn this around? And surely this must be something that government and other investors are looking to in South Africa. Would you lean into that, Adi?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely kind of critically important. And here, I think it's an example of what Trudy was talking about earlier. I mean, most of the areas that are identified in that report are areas that we would all agree on. And I think it's really a question of just focusing almost item by item and saying, you know, what are the things that we can check off really quickly? I think, you know, one of the great lessons for me about the Vulindlela program is, when you build capacity for very targeted and focused execution, you can get things done pretty quickly. And I think that's really what we need to help move us back. And I think we all need to agree. And the president has made this, remark many times, that us moving up on that competitive index is absolutely kind of critical for our economy and for creating jobs.
Thanks so much, Aiden. Of course, we are noting the comment that's come through about a one border post comparable to other African markets. And the question coming from our audience is, why do we not have this in South Africa? Just one of those examples where competitiveness, at least around our trade nodes, could be increased quite substantially. I do want to come back into studio and I come back to you, Prof. And I want to bring in the macroeconomic picture, if you will, for a moment, because we know that by the strain that's been put on public finances as a result of the pandemic has weakened our macroeconomic position to some extent. If we are really wanting to build back better, and obviously that means building back more resiliently with better buffers so that we can withstand future shocks, what needs to be true from a fiscal consolidation perspective to ensure that we can survive future economic shocks?
Indeed, the fragile state of our macroeconomy and state finances at the onset of the pandemic directly affected the scale and capacity with which government could respond. Think the size of the TERS grants, the speed and scale of the vaccination rollout, etc. This was also something I addressed in a chapter of the country's COVID-19 report due to be released soon by the DPME. And it's a narrative that it's imperative that not when, but if the next major economic shock hits, that we're in much better position, we're better prepared, not just administratively in a coordination and planning sense, but also economically and financially, so that we're able to afford the support needed at the scale required. Some fiscal consolidation will be an important part of achieving this. The success of the fiscal consolidation path Treasury has essentially been forced to embark on hinges on similar underlying conditions as I mentioned in my previous answer. Restoring high levels of economic growth, contingent on strong institutions, is the fastest way of solving our fiscal problems and building resilience. But that may not happen until certain pieces of the puzzle are in place. Dealing with the continued threat of COVID-19 to both lives and livelihoods, and the success of the vaccine rollout is, of course, also very important in the near term. Money will have to be spent smartly and effectively to achieve this, and officials must be held to account where they fail to do so. There's also been a lot of talk about reducing the relative size of the government wage bill as part of the fiscal consolidation process. But as we've also seen in recent public sector wage negotiations, unions and workers are not going to take the fall in terms of accepting lower wages or retrenchments if they believe top management, executives or politicians are the cause of the problem. Many of the problems that have caused government's exploding debt to GDP problem are not due to mismanagement and corruption and subsequent erosion of trust. Think of how SAA, Transnet and Eskom became the problems they are today, and how little it has to do with the average worker. If we want buy-in from workers to help achieve fiscal consolidation, trust must be restored and corrupt officials must be held to account. Thankfully, this process has now started, but a significant trust gap remains. Whilst the government sector is bloated in terms of its wage bill compared to many other countries, it is rather the productivity of our government workforce that should be of greater concern. That is, how much bang for our buck are we getting as taxpayers? Here again, good, smart management and the implementation of already good ideas can help a lot. Adaptation of technologies that will help, not replace labor, will also be very important. As a side note, to help perhaps illustrate this point, has anyone noticed the difference in technology and ease of doing business at SARS versus Home Affairs? Which department do you think values productivity more?
That's an excellent question, Prof, and certainly one that is worthy of a thesis or two, and how that then sits with this effort of closing the trust gap. I've got more questions from our global audience, and one of them I'm going to, two of them rather, I'm going to pose back to our World Bank team. But before I do that, I'd love to come to you, Tessa. You know, one of the things that the pandemic has really done is that it's had a near immediate effect on women's employment. We've seen millions of women being driven out of the workforce, literally. And perhaps the question to you now is, What have we learned about the pandemic's gender and effect, rather, and what would building a more inclusive and resilient economy mean for women at this time, Tessa?
Thank you for that. I think we've seen many gendered effects of the pandemic. In terms of things like lockdowns, we know that women in this country, in the main, are precarious workers. And so if you think about, again, those street vendors who are out in the streets in our society, many of them are women. Many women are also involved in agriculture in their communities, especially in rural areas, and in a lot of subsistence activities. But also the care economies that I spoke about earlier are predominantly led by women. So if you think about the social sector across the board, and we're not just here talking about in communities, but if you think about healthcare itself, there's a large contingent of people who are women in the healthcare sector. If we think about education, women dominate the education sector in our country. And so all of these areas where we've not only seen financial and economic big hits, we've also seen just the ways in which people have had to change their lives and spend more time in their homes, then has a double impact on women because they have the economic burdens of working outside of the home, but they've also been compounded by the ways in which lockdowns have added layers into the care economies in their own homes and the ability to look after their families at an emotional level, a psychosocial level, and an economic level. So there's certainly many gendered components, and not the least of them being gender-based violence, which we have seen have not only spikes during different times of lockdown, but also where we just don't have the kind of capacity and resources that we need in all communities in order to create places of safety for women and children in our economy. So we definitely do need to be thinking about that. And I think part of our response at an economic level needs to be thinking about how are we going to have a catchment for the most vulnerable people in the times of both economic and social need. And so something like the conversations that are happening around the basic universal support, the idea of a UBI, where people can have access to relief money, not based on having to apply for particular relief at a particular moment, but we need some kind of broad-based access so that if people fall into hard times, not only because there's a particular pandemic and a society-wide shift, but the mini shocks that people experience in their lives, UBI could be very useful for that. And I know that people will say, well, we don't have the fiscal space for something like UBI. But I think that as we create our fiscal policies going forward, we need to start thinking about how we create that space. I mean, we're borrowing money at large rates, and the problem there isn't what we borrow, it's what we spend it on. And something like a UBI and putting money into people's hands has proven, and the World Bank has got a great report that shows how putting cash grants in people's hands has an impact not only on them as individuals, but on the community level, because that money is not something people eat. They spend that money, and they spend it particularly in local communities. And so when we have that localization conversation, we can rather see that money going into local communities and having an effect on those communities that are marginal and the lives of people that are marginal, as well as a way to prevent those shocks at an individual and societal level from really taking people who are already marginalized and making them in crisis situations perpetually.
Yeah, Tessa, you've put a very big topic on the table, the topic of social protection flaws and the extent to which, there are deliberate efforts to make sure that everybody has some social protection net or floor beneath them. And what's unfortunate is that we've got so many questions coming in from our audience and just not enough time to get to all of them. I do want to quickly make a quick stop back in Washington to Franziska. There is a question here that is linked to the comments that we heard from Adi in terms of the vaccine rollout. Franziska, the question is this. Does the uneven global economic recovery not further highlight how vaccine nationalism is self-defeating and bodies like the G7 and the G20 need to do more to ensure supplies of vaccines to developing countries as part of a broader global recovery effort? Franziska, your thoughts on that?
That is an absolutely critical question. The pandemic will not be over until it's over everywhere. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So just to give you an idea, just consider these two numbers to give you an idea of the kind of discrepancy. In advanced economies, the average advanced economy, 50% of the population has received at least one dose. In the average low-income country, I mean, IDA countries to be specific, 3% have received, 3% of the population have received one dose of the vaccine. That automatically creates the risks that the pandemic flares up again. And it's not just a risk for one country. With the variants traveling, this is a risk to the global recovery, that one variant travels from one country and spreads around the world and derails the recovery everywhere. So it's absolutely critical that the vaccine rollout be broadened across as large a group of countries as absolutely possible. And I think there is increasingly a push now from all sides to broaden the vaccine rollout. It's an important question.
Yeah, it's an important question and one that I think you've given an important answer to, Franziska. Let me make my way back to Pretoria. And Wolfgang, let me come to you as part of the team that put together the South Africa Economic Update. There's a question from our audience here that says, well, what pieces of labor legislation might you suggest a moratorium on? Do you think this is a viable approach given the very vocal labor movements in South Africa? Should pro-employment policies not focus more on the demand side? Well, it's certainly more than one question there, Wolfgang, but I'm sure you can give us some of your thoughts on that question.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the great discussion. Let me just make one broader point and be brief to respond. We are very happy that most respondents said that this report resonates and is not, in some sense, not a surprise. We didn't want to surprise anybody with recommendations or suggestions, analysis. We wanted to put it in a broader international perspective, and that's why Franziska's contribution was critical for us as well. In the end, we don't have any view on the specific labor regulations. We think it is a good time to use the strong negotiated framework that South Africa has through NATLAC to basically reflect on what was discussed today and what Trudy outlined. It says, in the end, how do you encourage more private sector driven job creation? And there's a lot of ideas here in this room. There's ideas in the report. There is not specific items that we would think we are best placed to put forward. As I'm on this, just to close on this, there's another question. I think what Western Cape did well in terms of creating that Silicon Cape. And I think what Western Cape did is three things. One, very strong university, like here, the one we are presenting, best ease of doing business in South Africa, and creating, as a result, that kind of brand that says, you know, that's a place to go to for an investor, for a talent, and for a student possibly. And I think that's what I think is one of the lessons, and Tessa spoke very well to this. Final nice point maybe for you, just to end with a number and illustration. This emerging tech sector, including in Cape Town, actually has one big advantage also, because services are increasingly tradable. So you can actually use your talent and sell it elsewhere. And guess what? What is the price? Well, how much can somebody earn inside the space? If you're really low entry at the beginning, very young, you can very easily earn 300 rands an hour if you are in the data science tech community. That's at least a low price in Europe and in the US. And that's the type of opportunities these young talents have. And I think that's the broader job and engine that we want to highlight, and that South Africa can benefit from like other countries. Thanks so much again.
No, Wolfgang, thank you very much. And of course, lifting some of those insights in terms of what the IT sector did in Cape Town and what we could lift from that. There's been so many contributions from our global audience, and I certainly hope that this is an indication to both the University of Pretoria and the World Bank teams that these conversations are very much valued. A quick comment coming through right now saying, an excellent discussion, and just last week, URSA had an event discussing monetary policy and more broadly raised the issue of the credibility of institutions. The question there being, what can practically be done to make big institutions more efficient, because changing regulations seems to take too much time. Now, another comment that I'm just going to read off before we close off says, in September 2018, at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, business asked President Ramaphosa whether the government could commit to detailed timelines and goals. He responded by saying that his middle name is implementation. However, as yet we have seen very little and very slow implementation. with no detailed timelines that have been published so that ministers can be held accountable. For example, the DMRE and its response to load shedding. And so, as a final comment, Trudy, I would love to just hear your thoughts on this closing question that I'm going to bring to you. There have been a lot of themes about a gap in trust, a gap in the credibility of institutions, potentially a social contract that has been frayed at the edges between the people and government, between the people and business. We did hear AD saying that there has not been a dent, however, in the spirit of partnership between government and business, which is really encouraging. But perhaps in the last 60 seconds as we wrap this up, what do you think you would love to leave the people of South Africa watching this particular broadcast as we all look to build back better, and to Prof. Bowman's contribution to build back bigger as well and more inclusively? Your final thoughts.
Thank you. No, I'm happy to report that, all ministers have their performance agreements published. So one can track what they are accountable for. And of course, their departments also have very detailed annual performance plans that can also be tracked. Operation Vulindlela also has a public dashboard where the progress of each reform is shown, as there's also a dashboard on the public employment initiative. So all of that information is available. And of course, the economic reconstruction and recovery plan also came with timelines that are public for each intervention. At NEDLEC, the social partners also go through detailed project plans. And of course, that's obviously ongoing, where government, business, community, and labor consistently talk at great detail on each intervention. So I'm happy that certainly we've covered that part. This year, there hasn't been a month where there hasn't been a major significant development announced by the president, built on ports, on energy. Spectrum will be forthcoming on skills. And so I think we've got very great momentum and showing demonstrable results. He goes to the places, he demonstrates what has been done, but also talks to what still needs to be done, because one shouldn't overestimate where we are. We have, a mammoth task. We've been taking the steps in the right direction, and I think it's all out there for anyone to view. But we still need to do a lot more. But the institutions like Operation Vulindlela, like the work that's been done by the Economic Recovery Council, by NEDLEC, are slowly showing that they have the capacity and can achieve outcomes. Thank you.
We have a mammoth task ahead, but we're certainly taking steps in the right direction. That's the final message from the conversation, and that's how we close it. I would like to thank our online audience first and foremost for joining us. Remember, as always, for joining this event, you will be getting an email that has the link to the South Africa Economic Update, as well as, of course, a link to this recording should you wish to watch it once more. A massive thank you to all our speakers, the World Bank team, as well as our panelists who made time in their very busy schedules to really lean into this report and to share some of their insights. Thank you to Professor Coupe, of course, for hosting us today, as well as the World Bank and UP teams who have made this conversation possible. For my side, let's remember that we can still keep this conversation going. Let's amplify it in social media. Our hashtag is World Bank Economic Report, as well as SA Economic Report. Remember, you can also keep this conversation alive with me at The Real Nosy. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Remember, do stay safe. Until next time, from myself here in Pretoria, it's goodbye for now.